Kabini is currently the co-president of the OCIES and has been with the Victoria University of Wellington for more than 20 years. His previous roles included being the director and CEO of the Solomon Islands College of Higher Education, which is now the Solomon Islands National University. And he has also been a school principal, director of teacher education, and director of the Institute of Education at the University of South Pacific. So he's been around a lot in a few roles around the region. He has been and he still is mentor to many of the emerging Pacific researchers and educational leaders. He's also, Kabini is also the convener of the Leadership Pacific Initiative, and as well as the convener of the Rethinking Pacific Education Initiative for and by Pacific peoples, which continues to frame and inspire the work of many of our emerging Pacific scholars. And many of you will be familiar with Kabini's academic writing and research in Indigenous Pacific research, Talk Story, Pacific research, philosophy and epistemology, and Indigenous Pacific leadership. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kabini. I would also like, at this point, you're muted at Kabini, so you can't say anything. Not yet, anyway. I would also like to welcome Associate Professor Eve Coxon, who is past president of the OCIES and is currently the OCIES representative to the World Congress of Comparative Education Societies. She's held academic positions at the University of Auckland for over 25 years. And prior to that, she was a school teacher. Her interdisciplinary teaching and research programs are reflective of previous senior academic positions with the Centers for Pacific Studies and Development Studies. Many of you would know that the specific focuses of her work and writing within the broad field of comparative and international education are education and development in the Pacific, education in fragile states. And she has been frequently engaged as a researcher consultant by many international organizations, but also by many of the governments in the Pacific Islands, as well as in New Zealand, and as policy advisor and consultant to other countries around the world. So please join me in welcoming Associate Professor Eve Coxon.
And to continue on to more panelists that we have, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Robin Burns. With 27 years of teaching experience at La Trobe University, Dr. Robin Burns has been an important voice in the field of comparative international education. She has researched and written extensively on comparative international education, including specifically in Australia, Timor-Leste, Namibia, Sweden, and on the topics of peace education, feminism, teacher education, and development education. Dr. Robin Burns led one of Australia's first social science studies in Antarctica, documenting the experiences of 132 women from a number of countries who lived and worked there between 1959 and 1999. She also attended the inaugural meeting of the original society in 1973, and in 1985 to 1988 was the first female president of what had become OCIES. So please welcome me in joining Robin in this session. And then lastly, we have Giuliana Mclaughlin. Giuliana Mclaughlin, PhD, is a senior lecturer in the creative industries faculty at the Queensland University of Technology, Brisbane, Australia, where she teaches critical Indigenous studies in higher education, decolonizing methodologies, research ethics and protocols, and cultural studies. Her teaching and research are informed by post-colonialism, critical race and critical studies, decolonization, and Indigenous standpoint frameworks. She has a track record in supervising international and domestic doctor of philosophy and professional doctorates from multidisciplinary backgrounds and projects to successful completion over the last 20 years. Her research is driven by her passion for decolonizing research and education, social justice, equitable development, and international education. Giuliana has extensively published in refereed journals and book chapters, serves on journal editorial boards, and has provided expert reviews for a number of manuscripts for publishing firms. Giuliana worked as an academic advisor in the Udedru Unit, QUT Chancellery from 2004 to 2017, where she led and facilitated academic and cultural support of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students studying at QUT. She is a past president of the Australia-New Zealand Comparative and International Education Society, currently OCIES. Juliana is from Manus Island, Papua New Guinea. So please welcome Juliana as well. Thank you. So just to get us started, as with the style of discussion we're having today with the Talanoa, we're going to pose a couple of themes. So any of our guests that would like to contribute towards a thought on that theme, please feel free, and then we'll go from there. So the first theme is, what is comparative and international education in terms of a field of study? Remember to unmute yourself if you'd like to contribute something.
I could start perhaps, Ben. The first thing about CIE, or as just comparative education as it was known for a long time, is that it is quite deeply entangled in colonial and neo-colonial aspects of education. Now, I'm not going to talk at length about them because I'd rather talk about what I like about comparative and international education, but just noting that, societies such as ours are doing quite a bit of work to challenge those sorts of entanglements. Okay, what I like about CIE is that it is interdisciplinary. Many comparative and international educationists draw on history and social sciences such as sociology, anthropology, development studies, Pacific studies, psychology, and so on. And I particularly like reading CIE articles and books and so on that do that. Another thing I like about it is that theoretically, methodologically, it is eclectic, it is wide open. You are not confined to a particular theoretical approach. You might choose to write from, say, critical realism, like Sonia did in her thesis, or Indigenous research and theory, epistemologies, etc. Methodologically, I think a lot of CIE people use qualitative more than quantitative, but there is quite a strong school of quantitative researchers in CIE as well, and mixed methods, of course. The other thing I like about it is that it is both academic and applied. Some CIE theorists and presenters and so on in some societies prefer to write theoretically only, but a heck of a lot of people draw on their applied work in the field to shape their theory, and I like that aspect. There's a notion that comes up sometimes, the academic practitioner. That is that people like many of us who don't see themselves as one or the other, or a researcher practitioner if you don't want to adopt the academic label. Okay, enough from me for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve. So maybe to unpack this terminology a little bit more, we talk about comparative and international education. From our panelists, why is it important for us to use both of those terms, or what happens when we divide that and we talk just about comparative or just about international education? What's lost if we don't have that sort of combined terminology?
Can I step in a little bit there, Ben, and point out that I think the comparative side of it, while it is both, well, it is very much a strength of the field, it's also been a weakness. We had a member of staff at La Trobe, not in the comparative centre, who wrote his thesis demolishing the possibility of comparison in education, which was rather drastic when he became dean and closed our centre down. However, I think the comparative side of it, in a sense, grows out, in my understanding, of anthropology, where in fact we study another system in a way in order to throw light on our own. And I think this is a side of it that is, in a way, in danger of being lost. Although I don't think we can say that you're not doing comparative if you're not actually at least working across two fields, two systems, two instances within a system, etc. But that bearing that in mind, and also the consideration that, in a way, our unit of analysis is the system. Now, that doesn't have to be confined to the nation, as Robert Cowan has recently written about, but that it is, in a sense, larger than a lot of educational studies which deal with the micro. And I think keeping that in mind is an important side of the comparative. I've never really come to terms with the international, particularly when international education became a profit-making business. But it does also, I think, throw the hat into the ring that we're dealing in the era of globalisation with something that has to take into account our universe.
Could I just add to what Robin has said? The international aspect of CIE gets talked about quite often at big conferences like the North American CIE Societies Conference. And some comparativists reject it, as I think you mentioned Cowan does. But the international was brought in as a sort of gesture, I suppose, to education and development, the field of education and development, which a lot of us in OCIES are involved in. Development being in scare quotes, it's contested. Okay, we recognise that development, developing, etc., are contested terms. But agreeing with Robin that international education itself is a very looking at education as a commodity to a large extent. I think the notion of education and development is a bit different. Of course, quite often you are working, someone like me going into a place like Tonga to do some research or whatever is not necessarily going there to reflect my own views. I might in fact try hard not to. And so it's not just about learning about another context, it's about learning from as well. So, I'm comfortable enough with that international thing. I think they could have perhaps thought of a better descriptor than international for people who work cross-culturally and so on. But, or between, in globalizing terms, between so-called developed and developing. And of course, it's part of our name, so we have to deal with it. Or appropriate it if you wish.
Thank you, Eve. Thank you, Robin.
Can I just ask Eve how she reacts to the fact that the World Council of Comparative Education Societies does not include international? I'm interested, Eve, that you include or base it on development. I always thought that was part of comparative, that you didn't have to add.
Well, it is, of course it is. But I think that in the US, when they introduced the international term, it was about moving beyond a Western-centric approach to some extent. I think WCCES was stuck in the mud for a long, long time. The fact that currently WCCES is making huge efforts to diversify and to be more inclusive of the world. It's never come up in any discussions I've had about do we need that in there. I think if you look at the current sort of vision of the council, the World Council, you can see that they are not the white boys club they used to be, perhaps. And there is some resistance to that, of course, but yeah.
Excellent. I'd love to hear some thoughts from Kabini and Juliana on this field of comparative and international education. If we position it within the Pacific region, would you say that there are particular characteristics of the field when we're looking at this region in particular, and the research that's coming from the region?
Julie, you go first.
I was hoping you would go first, Kabini. Before I say a few things, I'd like to acknowledge the original custodians of the lands on which I'm speaking from, and acknowledge that these have always been places of teaching and learning, and from which I frame my discussions and contributions to the work I do. Thank you, Robin and Eve, for those comments. Comparative and international education can be a strength of what we can do, gives us the potential frameworks to do the jobs that we can do in terms of education development, or development education, or education for developing or post-colonial nations. I find the terms international education quite fascinating, because COVID in 2020 taught us a few things about the power of international education and how it can be translated. So most of you would know how our universities are bending backwards because of the funding that comes from international education. Now that is one prong of it. The other thing is that international education in the Pacific is not always a favorable term. And basically, international education has always been associated with something that's foreign. And so in that case, we have systems of education in our island nation states in the Pacific that's basically catering to children of the expatriate community or the elite of these island states. So in that case, international education is a term that's problematic. But what we have to also understand in terms of our field is that it is an important aspect of the work we do. Because if we link to education in the Pacific, a lot of the systems have been uncritically transferred from the colonial context. And so therefore, what does it mean for us to engage in making sure that the islands in the Pacific have a system of education, have curriculum processes and content, pedagogical processes that is tapping into local wisdom and knowledge systems. And so that is the opportunity that lends to us as comparative education researchers. What does it really mean? And I like what Robin said, and I went back to read a book chapter on the work that I did recently. And what George Baraday said about conducting comparative education research basically gets us to hold a mirror in front of us. So we look at the Pacific Islands, but at the same time, we're looking at ourselves in that mirror. So for me, in the work I do, I think comparative education and its methodologies has allowed me to understand Indigenous context, or context of minority groups living in Australia. We think about studies of systems of education. Does the study of system of education in Australia apply to all? So those are the things that I find quite exciting in the field of education. Comparative education. It is problematic, both comparative and international, but the potential that we can tap into is very real, and it's important work. I'll stop there. Kabini?
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Ben. Yeah, I am just like many of you in this space, a newbie to CIE, partly because I've never really been coming around to CIE, and yet, thanks to Eve, I have become part of CIE as of recent years. So responding to Ben's particular question to us, I'd rather start with who we are first, as opposed to start with CIE, to then talk about CIE in the Pacific region. I would like to think that as a region, generally speaking, we can still think about ourselves as a people first kind of group. And consequently, we can still think ourselves as being very relational to others. And because of that almost cultural kind of strength that might describe us as a region, we have capacities that we can then use, capacities that help us to still entertain and talk about the marks of yesteryears. And that's why, for me personally, when I'm sitting in a CIE WCCES meeting or conversation, even when I know very little about WCCES or know very little about the people that I'm sitting around with, I don't think myself little or think myself less or think myself not having what is probably appropriate or needed to be part of the conversation. And so I'm saying that as peoples of this region, we want to be very clear about how we might be content about ourselves as a relational people who not only can entertain the reflections on yesteryears and some of the mistakes that we may have committed or others may have committed, but we can also learn from those mistakes, use those mistakes to both exercise and demonstrate endurance, while also commit to the conversations about tomorrow, so that we may continue the journeys that we should continue, that we should begin, or that we should then create as ways of forging into tomorrow. And in that sense, I think we still have that regional, global capacity as a region to then be ourselves in what might be a wider CIES global conversation. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you so much to our panel for that their input. Now we're going to move on a little bit, but I would like to encourage people that if you have your questions to post them in chat and we can take them anytime. Now, following on from what Kabini mentioned, talked about understanding ourselves first before understanding the space. My next question that I would like to put out there to our panel, what is it, could you tell us, share with us a little bit more about the vision and mission of OCIES and why this has been important for you personally? So I feel that understanding that will also help some of us emerging researchers find ourselves in that space. Thank you.
Maybe I'll start since Bex and I are the co-presidents of OCIES right now. If I'm interpreting that question specifically about the vision of OCIES, so that from that specific interpretation, we might then talk about how that might play out within the wider CIES space. Again, let me refer you back to our starting point this afternoon, which was where Tepora provided or made reference to our welcoming mat. And some of you who had been in the last couple of years of OCIES general meetings, AGMs, you would have remembered we have physically used the mat as a metaphorical representation of both who we are as well as what our vision was as a community within our region. And we did say that using the mat metaphor, that we are inviting, we are welcoming to all our people or whoever is interested in being part of us, that the mat is at the ground level, is a space that we can all sit in. The mat has features of multiple strands that we can all identify with. So within the conversation of comparative ed, of course, because it's an umbrella notion, it gives us that space so that you can be yourself and you can go ahead and conquer your worlds, whatever they might be. And in that sense, I think from a journeying perspective, those of you who've been around OCIES in the last little while, I see my friend Tangata Ese there, who is still the guardian of our OCIES walker. We did adopt that walker as representing the journey that we in OCIES are taking, and how a functioning walker always bears the marks of yesteryears. How a functioning walker is there's always enough space for all of us to play our role in a functioning walker. And in that sense, I think a part of the vision of OCIES is to hopefully sow this seed of a way of thinking in our new generation intellectual leaders, so that this way of thinking, this mindset, might in fact be the kind of mindset that allows us to be better straddlers of worlds in our time, as opposed to not so good straddlers of worlds. And so in that sense, I think a vision we might be playing at this time might involve seed sowing of ways of appreciating ourselves and ways of thinking about ourselves, so that we are ourselves regionally or locally within our context, regionally as well as globally. And that's how we flourish as we are as a people of this region. Thank you.
Thank you, Kabini. Would one of Robin or Eve or Juliana like to?
Could I say
Yeah.
a little bit, please, Tafora?
Yes,
And
please.
thank Kabini for that. I found that very refreshing and very moving, Kabini. But it made me think that when I went to that inaugural meeting back in 1973 of what was then the Australian Comparative Education Society, we were there providing a space for people who had worked overseas in education, who were feeling a bit out of it in their particular contexts, and who formed together in what was always a convivial and very accepting society. And when I got back into OCIES 3 years ago, after a long gap, I found that that had been enormously strengthened, but that there was a continuity in both the concern with context in our understanding both of ourselves and of education, historical, cultural, socio-political, economic, etc. And that there is both a resource of ideas in comparative education, but very importantly in OCIES, the capacity, I believe, to draw on that within the regional context to bring out knowledges, experiences, failings, critiques, and to contribute that not only to each other in a supportive way, but to the wider comparative education, comparative and international education community.
Yeah, I'd support what Robin says, and of course that means supporting everything that Kabini said. I think the place that OCIES has come from, and it was what, 6 years ago that the decision was made to move from ANZ to Oceania, and it was made after quite a long time for discussion and debate, etc. Not everyone was happy about it. But the whole idea was to diversify our society, because, you know, if you read the paper that Juliana and I wrote for World Voices Nexus, you would know what I'm talking about. So I won't go into depth about that. But there was a need to revitalise our society. As Robin said, it has always been a very convivial group. There has been space for people, you know, when it was ANZ as well, space for people to share ideas and so on. But the conferences have become small, and well, not always small. There was one in Brisbane that was great and one in Auckland that was great. But sometimes they were limited in their themes and so on. And we were very worried, those of us who are older, about the fact that we weren't getting through an energised young group in the way that we have now. So yeah, OCIES has expanded the regional society, but it has maintained continuity with the strength that was there prior to the shift of name from ANZ to OCIES. I mean, just looking at the screen now, I think we've certainly succeeded in the aim of the name change in diversifying our membership and attracting energetic young scholars from across the region. we've expanded our notion of regionalism. ANZIES was only the second regional society in the World Council. There are a few more now, but I think OCIES now stands out as one that is contributing to global ideas on comparative education more than it did in the past.
Thank you, Eve. Now, we were just thinking that, you know, many of the countries in Oceania have education systems that are still sort of grappling with, you know, remnants of their colonial past and finding a way towards a sustainable future. And a lot of our NERF community are working or beginning to work in this space. And I guess the question that I would like to pose is, how would being a member of OCIES support our own beginning endeavors, research attempts in this space?
Okay, if I could say a few things here, I'd like to add on what Kabini and Eve and Robin have said. And in terms of the young and emerging researchers in the field of comparative and international education in Oceania, and at the same time, how we are entangled with global priorities, and yet they are contextual issues that either respond or sometimes are often swayed by the entrenchment or the wave of global imperatives. And so in that case, the intellectual contributions that we can make here, and it comes from, I see a question in the chat space about why should we engage? I'd like to just confirm what my panel experts have said, and it's about that intellectual contributions. Often a lot of the way we do education in the smaller states are dictated by the powerful states, and often are dependent on aid relationships and who is funding certain projects in education. And so in that case, we also think about our education leaders and practitioners in those countries and how their positions are also compromised by the fact that they needed the funds in order to advance education. So how do we then sit back knowing what we do and what we know, and not to say something about providing both theoretical, but at the same time, some informed understandings of what is actually going on. So basically, that is what I see as our process of how we engage as both insider and outsider researchers, but at the same time allowing the voices from our island states to speak to the region to start with, and perhaps to the world about who we are and how we are located in advancing our own communities. I don't know whether that made any sense.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Juliana. Yes, please.
Can I add to this question? Let me restate what I think is important. So for new and emerging OCIES researchers, the way we think is important. So where you think is very important. And I did say that we have to be content about ourselves. We cannot we cannot think little of the fact that Deborah, you were Samoan and you had worked in Samoa and doing PhD work now in New Zealand. I cannot excuse myself for the fact that I was born and raised in East Malaita, Solomon Islands. So that mindset of contentment is foundational for anything else we might add to how we might be brilliant in our world and in our time. Let me translate that a bit more. So if, unlike other contexts where we might say, oh yeah, I'm a researcher, I'm an academic researcher, I am not a practitioner, I'm not involved in applying ideas to deal with real life educational problems. In our region, we cannot really say that. And hence many of us do a bit of this and that. Many of us, as I said, we straddle the different policy domains. And because of that, and because of the times, I think we should major in learning or upskilling ourselves to be translators in our modern worlds. And consequently, OCIES might help us to really think about first order things and be clear about first order things and be able to separate first order considerations from second order considerations. And a clarified understanding is probably necessary and is essential before any other agendas relating to skill sets or competencies or anything like that. I think competencies and other things we can do or not do or know are really second order things. Anyway, let me stop there because I might just wander off, which I don't like because it won't be of help to anybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Kabini. Would anyone else like to add from our panel?
Could I just add something to what Kabini says about within our society, we have to be at ease with ourselves, where we're coming from and so on. I think that's really important. Raywin, just responding to your message in the chat line. Yes, the field is highly contested. And yes, some of the underlying assumptions are problematic. But I don't think there's any area of education, research and practice that is not problematic, doesn't have underlying assumptions that we should be wary of. And I think that OCIES is heading in a great direction in terms of challenging those in dealing with the contestations. I think if a field had no contestations, it would be boring perhaps. So yeah, agree what you say. I still think that it's a field worth engaging in because it's so wide open. It's so inclusive in terms of approaches and so on. Yeah.
Thank you, Eve. Oh, Raywin has just responded. Actually, Raywin, if you don't mind, would you like to unmute yourself and share your comment?
I've got some co-inhabitants that might be noisy in the background, but nevertheless, thank you. And I don't want to take time away from the panelists. I'm just really engaging in this space for the first time, but also really heartened and interested to hear what all of you are saying about I guess all kinds of things. And I don't want to try and frame what you said because you said it so well, but just how somebody who maybe sits on the fringes of this field might engage you know, in really productive ways. And those are the questions that I brought to this today. And what I'm really kind of, I suppose, in the chat, trying to signal is I'm hearing answers to those questions. And not really, should we engage, wasn't really my question. It was more about how do we do good work in this space. Yeah, that's such a tricky space. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Rowan.
It's good. It is a question, Raylene, about why should we engage in this space? I think my colleague Anne Hickling Hudson some years ago was so disappointed and disillusioned basically when our university decided there was no space for teaching comparative and international education. And yet everybody does educational research in other countries. So how, when we think about the complexity of it, how do we then make sense of the fact that research in other contexts continues in many different fields without even engaging with comparative and international education? The frameworks that I've come to really embrace is that they are complex, they are problematic, but at the same time, they're intellectually stimulating. So in that case, it gives you another reason to think differently about what is going on. Thank you.
Zepora, can I make a comment following Raywin's point there? Raywin, hello to you. I suppose, yeah, I want to respond to the view that places the emerging researcher as if they were coming in at the edge. The line I was taking, which is if we learn to be content about ourselves and consequently about the passions that are motivating what we do, then from my perspective, that's a starting point. It's not a point at the edge. And we flourish as we are. And very soon you will realize that you are honey to the bees. And so from my perspective, whatever your starting point, in whatever environment, is not a point at the edge. You are not at the edge and someone else is at the center. And so understanding it that way doesn't trap us in the mindset of belittlement that is so pronounced in some quarters. And so I'm suggesting the way we think is very important in our region, because there's no time for the ongoing enslavement in our minds that are so common. The times now are times for the young people and the emerging researchers of our region to be the best of themselves, and in doing so, working together, hand-holding together, we might do that in bringing in our other like hearts around the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Kabini.
Thank you, panelists, and thank you, Raywin, for your question. This is something that we've also been discussing a lot within the NERF space, is our own sort of positionality, both within the region, of course, and within the field. So I guess an additional question for the panelists is, what recommendations would you share for this new and emerging researcher space on how to further position their research within this discipline? Not just within the geographic or regional space, but also within the discipline itself. Would you have some specific tips or guidance that you could give to newer and emerging researchers?
I think it's a good idea to the extent that you're not that familiar with comparative education literature, it might be a good idea to get familiar. But that doesn't mean to say you have to spend a whole lot of time reading, you know, comparative education review, Compare, which I think is a UNESCO journal. They're good journals, but you select what you're interested in terms of themes and so on. I think, you know, and to some extent I'm speaking for the World Council here, but a recent development in the World Council is the series of publications that they're putting up. I'm not sure if you can see that. No, not very clearly because I'm got bad lighting here. But Rebecca Spratt and myself and Saula for Johansson and another colleague from University of Auckland, Rebecca Jessen, we have put together a book that talks about the work we were doing in literacy and language and other areas in Tonga and in Solomon Islands. And it was the first one published in a new series coming from the World Council. Now, the advantage to us as editors, I mean, we've got, I think, all up 11 or 12 contributors to the book from Samoa, from Tonga, Solomon Islands, as well as University of South Pacific people and University of Auckland. The beauty of it was that Indri Asilamumba, who is the president of the World Council, had already negotiated with the publishers, Brawl Sense, which is a very good education publisher, the right to submit. You didn't have to negotiate the whole process of getting a book published by finding a publisher that would deal with it. I mean, of course, we had to meet their criteria and so on. But you could think about that perhaps. They also have what they call the World Voices Nexus, which is what Juliana and I submitted our paper on, moving from ANZIAS to OCIES on, where they publish in lots of languages for a start, which is a real breakthrough for comparative education to see themselves beyond English language. I mean, at the moment, it's just the 6 UN languages. But WVN publishes shorter pieces, 3,000 words, some not highly scholarly, some more about where people, identity issues, things like that. But I think you should look at it and see yourselves as perhaps submitting. And I know the editor would be very pleased to get more papers from OCIES on that. And then they also have the Global Comparative Education, which some of our members have already published in, but that's open too. I think that we also should start thinking about, if it's still going to happen, that we're doing a joint conference at the end of the year, maybe this year, maybe next, I don't know. But the theme of that conference with the University of Manoa in Hawaii is, and it's a joint CIES, which is the North American, the biggest comparative education society in the world, and OCIES, perhaps working together. I'm not sure, I'm on the edge here. But the theme is about addressing the colonial and neo-colonial entanglements within which comparative and international education is located. So that would be a good one, given some of the discussion we've had this morning, for NERF to engage with NERF members. Putting up panels, whatever, conference panels, more than one if you wish.
Ben, can I add one or two things following Eve's good input there. If you don't have a mentor, or not really putting value to mentoring or on mentorship, please find one, or give importance to mentorship. Many of our people in OCIES are quite happy to support our emerging researchers. So I'm encouraging emerging researchers to don't shy away, but to be receptive to being mentored, especially when it comes to publishing your work. And not everybody will have work published in this journal or that journal or this book or that, but that doesn't stop you or shouldn't discourage you from just getting on and doing it. Besides mentoring, which is so important, as I said, to flourish as you are, whatever the level or whatever the platform or whatever the arena, you only do that without competition if you stay true to yourself. And that's why if you are, put on your Samoan mind, put on your Tongan intellectual mind, someone like Dr. Sonia Fonua, put on your world straddling mind, and go ahead and be yourself in whatever the contribution you are making in whatever the forum. It's when you are trying to write like Eve Coxon, or write like Unaisi Nambobo, or write like Juliana, that you are going to lose it entirely. So be yourself, and that's the only way you are the best of yourself. And in being the best of yourself, you cause the whole lot of us to rejoice with you, and you enhance the greater common good globally when you are being yourself in that way. But like any skill sets, like any knowledge, we actually acquire them, we learn them through practice and through just getting into them. So as I said, it's a journey. You start it and you go on it. And so in that sense, I think what you are doing already as the NERF community is quite honorable.
Yeah, it is.
Very good that you are doing this, and you are doing this together. That's what we need to, that's the how of doing this better. That is that you are doing this together. Now I'm gonna, Rebecca Spratt, the co-presidents, have had a conversation the other week about ideas that might catapult you as a group into the global stage, but that's for later. We'll have to talk with Eve so that Eve supports this at the World Council level. But there are ideas on how might we enhance the beauty that is OCIES, using the emerging researchers as the people of tomorrow to go hunting into the global world. But we will have the conversations with you later and via the General Committee. So I won't disclose anything now, but thank you again, Ben and Tepra.
Thank you very much, Eve and Kabini, for your wise counsel, and also for volunteering to serve as mentors. I'm sure many of the NERF community would greatly appreciate that.
Can I just note also a real plus about OCIES is its own journal, IEJ, Comparative Perspectives, in which a strong mentoring strand is coming through. you know, that's a real strength of our society, and one that you should make the most of the opportunity to access in various ways.
Thank you. One of the intentions that we have too as a NERF community is to create a regular space for those really interested in publishing, to come together on a more frequent basis to share ideas and brainstorm and perhaps co-author some pieces together. So we're going to really try to engage that space within the NERF community. Well, love to open it up for general questions and discussion and additional points that people would like to make. If there's topics or themes that we have not yet addressed that you'd like to hear from the panelists, or your own experiences that you'd like to share, please feel free to unmute yourself and share with the community.
Thanks, Ben and Te Pora. And thank you to the speakers for their contribution. What I mean, I've taken a lot from this session. And I keep hearing things like the us moving through, you know, us. It seems to be a word that is strong in the messages. And Eve, I mean, I really appreciated Eve's historical account of the move from ANZIs to OCIES, and talking about shifts and looking at diversity. I also appreciate the other scholars for their contribution in positioning themselves. There is something about us and being present that has taught me a little bit more sort of today. I'm also mindful that a lot of my early career Pacific colleagues who are not located in the islands, now in Australia, New Zealand, US, who are quite strong. They are quite forthright in really trying to reinvigorate Pacific Indigenous knowledge. And I enjoy that. I enjoy being in that space. The critical thinking in that space is beneficial for those of us that are moving through and finding our way. But when I come to OCIES, it's quite a different feeling. So I guess my question to the presenters is, it's quite confrontational in a generous way. With all this diversity in this shared space being present together, at the same time reinvigorating our Pacific Indigenous knowledge and views. And I keep thinking about Robin's comment on comparative, the look in and telling from the outside of what's in. What are some practices and ways of engaging that we need to shift in this shared space together, without losing all of those real key drivers? I'm just mindful that we have a group coming through that's quite strong about, you know, driving Pacific Indigenous, leading Pacific ways, and then navigating that and negotiating that with others. What are your, I'd appreciate your thoughts on that. Hello.
I'll go first. Thank you, Dave. yeah, the capacity for being present in a diverse, competing and multiple worlds is, of course, one that requires both a degree of humility to suspend and tolerate and to listen as opposed to speak very quickly. So from a capacities perspective, we need to use our ears more and maybe our eyes more as opposed to use our mouths less. Particularly when we are disagreeing with some of our friends within the OCIES mat. If you're coming at an agenda from the diasporic, indigenous, Australian, New Zealand, US-based emerging scholar perspective, of course, you will come at it very politically. Whereas the Samoan or the Tongan who is based in the island, grew up there, they'll approach it, they'll come at the discussion much more, in a much more restrained way, because they have their sense of tolerance for what might be a straight hit, might be a little more different than the indigenous metropolitan born person. So in that sense, I think these new sets of capacities are needed for that kind of a multicolored, I suppose multicolored, multiple strand mat that we all sit on. But let's appreciate that whichever interest or whichever positions any of our friends are starting from are starting points. And hopefully there is enough commitment to the group that we will see starting points for what they are and work with each other so that the greater common good is enhanced in time, as opposed to not giving time for each other just because we didn't like each other's starting points. Thank you.
Kabini, I do appreciate your very, very wise words and conversation about identity. I wonder if the NERF group might consider, as part of the conversations, and I deliberately say conversations plural, what part of their identity does comparative play? I think asking the question, is comparative part of my identity as an educational researcher, might be something that NERF can do to assist people in finding their place, their starting points, if you like, and the way to reach out to the wider comparative and international community.
Sounds like another event for 2021. I like the idea. That's a really good suggestion. Thank you, Robin. We also have another question that came in the chat. Can you please expand on this notion of being translators in our modern worlds? Who are we facilitating knowledge for and to? Is this related to the idea that as a Pacific researcher, we cannot separate research from its application? Can you please clarify?
Was I the one who used the term translators?
Yes.
Yeah. I suppose. Yeah. As particularly in our time, where where life is not just very plural and multiple, but that there are extreme expressions of difference that are overwhelming. And because of those exciting opportunities like that, that's where translators are needed. That's where those who might have the skills at being meaning makers are most needed. That's where educators come in. That's where bridge holders, those who act as bridges to strands of difference. That's where we need to come in, and that's where the kind of what it takes for leadership in our time is what we need to think about. And so rather than spend time reading Socratic questioning and learning to be asking hard questions, you might learn to enhance what being good mentors or good translators are, to cross those different boundaries, whether the boundaries are philosophical or whether they are cultural. And in that sense, that's why when I used the term straddlers of worlds, I was looking at the real leadership need in our time and in our region is really the kind of leadership that allows leaders to exercise straddling the different worlds, straddling the different interests, straddling the different agendas, some of which are political, some of which are cultural, some of which are ideological. And in that sense, the capacities that are needed for being better at holding difference together and forging the ways forward that might enhance the greater common good are things that, as a generation of Oceanic leaders, we might need to pay attention to a bit more. Anyway, I better stop there because I forgot the original question.
Just adding on to what Kabini says about the notion of the common social good, etc., I think it's really important. And I think that where we are in 2021, there are some obvious issues and themes that we should be addressing as a society or as individual academics or collaborators or whatever. I do think it's important, you know, obviously a key aim in becoming OCIES was about informing those of us who are not Indigenous to the region about Indigenous knowledge, etc., about us being able to learn from the people who are our colleagues who are Indigenous to the region, because it is absolutely crucial in this time when we're talking about sustainable education development. We're looking at the effects of climate change, etc., and the need to uphold human rights, not in the individualistic sort of United Nations sense, but that notion of commonality, I think, is really important. We're not only about Indigenous Pacific in Oceania, in OCIES, and we've got to keep aware of that, and also about our relationships with other regions. And some of you will know, maybe all of you know, about the fact that our ex-co-president Zane Diamond proposed that we convene the next World Congress. The World Council, as you may know, every 3 years it has a World Congress. And the proposal then was for having it in Cairns with the theme of education for sustainable water futures, I think. I'm paraphrasing, I mightn't have the wording quite right. Now, it was agreed that we would do that in collaboration with the Indian Ocean Comparative Society. When we've talked on the World Council about it, we recognise that our theme is such that it's not something we could do easily virtually. And the fact that it's a World Congress means that people from all over the world, different time frames, etc., would make it very hard to do virtually. So it looks likely at the moment that that will be put forward to 2003 rather than 2002. Again, I think it's really important that the notion of new and emerging researchers be placed at the forefront of whatever happens in terms of the program there. And I would hope that some of you are involved. But I do think it's, while it's absolutely exhilarating, really, that the Regional Comparative Education Society is able to learn from the Indigenous voices of the Pacific, of Oceania, and both the at-home and the diasporic voices of Pacific communities. It is also important that we locate ourselves more broadly. And I'll just say here that having Kabini on the executive of the World Council has been fantastic, and he has introduced the notion of relationality to the wider executive in a way that is bearing really productive fruit. So OCIES is certainly contributing on the world stage, but we need to make that, embed that in future years.
The question around our identity as researchers or educational practitioners is a very important one, I think. I think locating ourselves in the spaces that we occupy, both professionally and personally, gives us a powerful way of looking at our own locations, but at the same time, think about who we are in the Pacific. The Pacific Ocean is pretty big, but the islands are very small. And everyone in those little islands know each other. And going to Kabini's point about relationality, our work doesn't stop with our papers being written and reviewed and published. We carry our communities with us. And so the obligations, the levels of reciprocity that we have to return to our communities is also hugely important, that even though we classify ourselves as comparative education, and whether we are located in our own homelands or in diaspora, it doesn't mean that because we live in Australia or New Zealand, we've taken their islands away from us. Or our esteemed colleagues who've traveled the journeys with us, they've been to the islands, and the Pacific tends to hold very strongly in the minds and hearts of our colleagues. So in this case, the thing about translating knowledge is a very good point. Personally, I would say we don't need to translate our knowledge for anybody. We talk about our knowledge in order to give our own people the power to negotiate. Comparative and international education, as Eve is referring to, is a global body. At the same time, it gives us the platforms to represent the voices of our peoples. If we have the ability to do this, it's about a whole project of revamping the colonial spaces that had been imposed on us at one time. And so in that case, the project is bigger than us. It's not so much that we can write and hold expertise in the field as our predecessors had done previously, walking into a community and therefore becoming experts on those communities. But knowing that the relationality and reciprocity still guides what we do. But we cannot do that without understanding how global politics work and how it impacts on education and the future of our people on the islands. Just a few thoughts.
Yeah, the addition I'd make following Julie's comment about the dichotomous view of applicants or practitioners and theorists or researchers is that within our, I suppose, if I'm making a generalization about indigenous knowledge systems, I'll probably say that those systems are integrated systems, and consequently, you don't talk about them in either or terms. You talk about them as strands that constitute or make up a pattern of beauty, whatever that is. And hence we don't devalue ideas and put more emphasis on applications. Just to bring some encouragement to those of us who are university-based, who tend to major more on ideas. It's not of little value that we encourage someone else or we inspire someone else through ideas. It's not of less value that we affirm knowledge guardians, or we sow seeds into the minds of students or younger knowledge learners, or we support and affirm and stand with teachers on the ground or education officers who are writing policy. So in that sense, I'm saying that the world, the view that sees our role as part of the same complex world that requires multiple players to major on different parts, is the view that allows us to be content and to be content about ourselves, but also to appreciate what someone else is majoring on and why we also can still support them and be happy with what they are doing and not be judgmental about that or not be jealous about when they are becoming the best of themselves. Thank you. I think that.
Thank you so much for that, Kabini. And I think those are excellent words to wrap up our time together. Our apologies, we've gone slightly over time. But at this point, I would just like to hand it over to David Favai, or one of you and Sonia, who are the other two people in this NERF leadership team. Just say a few words very quickly to wrap up and say thank you to our esteemed panel.
Sonia, would you like to take this one, or are you happy for me to?
We'll do both, eh? I'll do a little bit and then you can. I would like to acknowledge that we've been wanting to do this panel for a number of years now. And Dave and Esse, if you're still here, we've been plotting and planning this type of historical kind of what's come before for a number of years. And so I'm really happy to see it's actually happened. I may have to mute myself because I also have guests at my house. And I'd like to acknowledge everyone for the generosity of their time and today, for sharing but also listening. OCIES, well, I attended ANZs before and at the time of the name change, and I've really appreciated seeing the shifts and changes that Eve and Robin and Kabini and Julie have all spoken about, but also understanding the generosity and sharing how these things are done. It's not behind closed doors, it's very much a collective of how things are worked, operated. Those are awful words, but it is very much a collective, and the relationality is the key aspect of this society that I appreciate the most, I suppose. From seeing how others function, other societies and organizations function, I always come back here because I know that this is a place that I will be looked after, but also challenged and critiqued. And I think, Kabini, your statements always write down lots of things, but the being content with who you are, like you always strongly encourage us to be content, but knowing that that's not a place to just sit, but to learn also, so that we can be content in our learning and acknowledge that we are new, and that's fine. It's not a judgment that you don't know enough yet, because you will, and what you do know is valuable. So I hope that other people who are new to this space gathered that too from what everyone has shared today. And I'd just like to acknowledge Ben and Te Pora's intensive organisation behind this session. They've been very busy in getting this going, and it's amazing. Thank you very much for all the time you put into it. And again to Robin, Eve, Kabini and Julie for your time and sharing what you know today, and hoping that that's encouraged others that this is a place that they would like to be in, and that it does have worth and value. So thank you.
Cool. Malo Sonia, Tautoko Sonia, and as we are about to depart, the same way that we came in, we honour the mat that we have come together and the people that have initiated our Talanoa today, that have really showed us how to work together and be present, be accountable to each other, and have confronting conversations, generative ones that can lead to progression. And that's what we appreciate at NERF. And we appreciate the leadership here, and also the leaders out in the region, who Kabini and Eve know very well, who have been part of their journey through as well. And so let us finish off. Ben and Te Pora, is that all right if we close off with a lotu? Cool. Mahalo. Ta lotu. Ta mai mawhimawhi ma watu heni wha ma logo hiko ho alo ofa. E ki koe Talanoa koe ni. Mau whaamu peta mai e hoko ai ngahi Talanoa koe ni ko ngahi Talanoa. E tupulaki ha ngahi whiohi e mawhana I he kaha u eiki. Father, we just ask that you continue to bless our wise panelists who gave up their time to come and share their wisdom and knowledge with us. We ask that you continue to provide for the NERF group, those that have come through and those that are still straddling their worlds, that we at some point will find a path. We ask that you bless them, keep them safe, and look forward to another NERF session. Malo. Amen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you. Stay posted on our Facebook page and LinkedIn page. We'll let you know what else is coming up. We have something exciting next month. In the meantime, be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.